Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are doing the player ranking for Total Drama Pahkitew Island, the final season from the original series. And honestly, Pahkitew Island is a mostly boring season with some good players, but honestly, I feel like a lot of these players just aren't as interesting to talk about as some of the previous seasons that we covered here. But there are 14 players to rank here, and without further ado, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 14, the player I believe played the worst game on Pahkitew Island is the first boot, and here we have Beardo. And for me, the thing about Beardo is he's essentially a worse version of B from Revenge of the Island, where he essentially does nothing during his time there. He literally just makes noises, never speaks up, never is shown interacting with anyone, and he is obviously eliminated first. And again, he is a worse version of B, where at least B was useful in challenges and somewhat endeared himself to some people despite him being a bit shy. But here with Beardo, he doesn't even have that. He literally just made noises and was promptly voted out the first opportunity. So because of that, he is here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we literally have the second boot of the season, and here we have Leonard. And people clearly know Leonard's a pretty bad player, and he definitely got on a lot of people's nerves. But there are two reasons why he's not the very bottom. I mean, for one, he does technically survive Beardo at the first elimination ceremony. He literally survives over him, so there's that. Despite him being in the bottom two at that first elimination, he still does survive it. And the other factor is, even in his elimination round, he did have Sugar on his side, technically speaking. And while I can argue whether that was a crush or whether that was a strategic relationship, he did at least have someone on his side even as he was being voted out. So for those reasons, I can't have him at the very bottom, but he's very bad socially and he contributed very little to the game, so because of that, he is here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and this person is a bit more interesting to talk about, but even then, they didn't play super well, and here we have Samey, one of the two twins, and technically the one that was voted out before Amy, but got to last a couple more rounds. And the tough thing about Samey is that she was technically voted out third, and the first one voted out of her team. We clearly saw a lot of those team members favor Amy over her, and we saw Samey stay essentially because she was able to take Amy's place and pretend to be Amy for the next couple rounds afterwards, even though people like Jasmine knew about her secret anyway. But the main reason I have her this low, aside from being voted out, is the fact that Amy did technically take control of the team over her, and even after she survives over Amy, like a lot of people still assume that she's Amy, and we hear a lot of people talk pretty negatively about her. But to her credit, she does technically build a relationship with Jasmine, although even then, I feel like a lot of that is due to Amy's poor treatment of her over anything else. And in the end, while she does survive over Amy, she doesn't really use that to her benefit at all. Like, she's largely just living a lie these next couple of rounds of her pretending to be Amy, and then when she's eventually found out to be the imposter, both of them are sent out at the same time. And on top of that, she was technically voted out first before Amy, so it's a tough game to really assess. I can't have her too high, but she does have a bit more positives than the previous two people we talked about, so she is here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we are technically sticking with the boot order here, and here we have Rodney. And there isn't too much to say about Rodney as well. He was largely there to get into a relationship, and we see him fall in love with multiple people like Jasmine and Scarlett, and later with Amy. And it's largely just him being a bit of a mess as he's trying to navigate all these relationships. He keeps trying to break up with people, which isn't great on paper, but also not great in the sense that he doesn't really have great relationships with any of these people to begin with. Aside from Jasmine, I guess. But even then, he's not super well positioned throughout a lot of the game. And he is voted out relatively early, all things considered. Despite him technically being one of the more physical people on his team, he is still voted out at the second opportunity, which isn't great. And I feel like he didn't really come to play the game. He was more there to find love, which leads me to put him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and I can see the debate for this person being even lower on the list. However, I feel like they had a bit more agency and were trying to play the game a bit more, but were largely ineffective. And here we have Ella. And Ella is tough because on one hand, she's definitely more of a social pariah than a lot of the other people we just talked about. I mean, we saw her get on the nerves of a lot of her teammates, and she only gets as far as she does due to them winning so many challenges. I mean, yeah, she does technically survive 2 elimination ceremonies, but she survived them over Beardo and Leonard, so not exactly the best company to be better than, per se. And she does try to play the game a bit more than some of the people we just talked about. She tries to build an alliance with Sugar, but is largely ineffective in doing so because of how much Sugar hates her. And she also tries to build a relationship with Dave, but Dave just finds her a bit annoying. And plus, Dave had his eyes on other people, which we'll be talking about fairly soon. So it's not a great game to consider. But the main reason I have her this high is that, again, I feel like she played a bit more than someone like a Rodney, and she didn't have the big flaws of someone like a Beardo or a Leonard. Again, people that she literally survived a vote over, as well as Samey, someone who was literally voted out at the first opportunity. And even through her quote unquote second chance, she didn't really do much to better her position. I feel like Ella at least tried to do so, but failed to do so largely due to her inability to build social relationships. So, again, I can see the debate for her being lower in the sense that she failed more at what she was trying to do, but I feel like what we saw here was enough to land her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we're finally moving back to the third boot of the season, and here we have Amy. And the main reason I have her this high is that, well, she shouldn't have been the third boot of the season. She did technically get most of the team on her side and survive a vote over Samey, but it was just that Samey was effectively able to make it so that people thought that she was Samey, and through that get herself eliminated from the game in Samey's place. So I feel like through that, this is another Courtney situation from Island where she was technically cheated out of the game and probably should have lasted quite a bit longer than what she should have. But obviously, you do falter a bit more than Courtney because she did alienate Amy to the point where Samey was willing to do that against Amy and get herself out of the game. So again, it is a give or take there. And on top of that, there were people that recognized that Amy was being a bit unfair to Samey, particularly a Jasmine. But Amy was effectively able to get most of the team on her side early on to where she was able to survive that first vote over Samey, barring the weird stuff that happened. However, I can't have her too high because at the end of the day, she was still the third boot. She was more at fault for being the third boot than Courtney was back on Island. And even if she had survived that vote, I mean, it's hard to say whether she would have gotten all the way to the end, as I feel like her style of gameplay would have eventually caused a flip, particularly around that merge, as I don't see someone like a Jasmine or a Sky or a Shawn allowing someone like an Amy to get too deep into the game. So it's sort of a tough game to assess, but I feel like what we saw was impressive enough to land her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have a very interesting player to talk about, and one who on paper didn't play the worst game in the world for the most part, but really spiraled towards the end of their run. But here, number 8, we have the merge boot of the season, and here we have Dave. And Dave, on paper, didn't play the worst pre-merge in the world. I mean, he did only go to 2 elimination ceremonies in the pre-merge, so take that as you will. But he is technically able to build some pretty good relationships throughout the season. I mean, Ella is someone who has a crush on him, although even then he doesn't realize it and pretty much friend zones her, so there's that. But obviously the main defining feature of his game is his growing crush on Sky. Now, obviously, Dave is not the first person in Total Drama to build a crush with someone over the course of their season, but the way he goes about it is very creepy, and I feel like it definitely starts to define his game as he's becoming less and less successful. I mean, I think one of the most blatant examples of his failure to recognize Sky's feelings comes when he literally tells her about his feelings, and that Sky in turn says that she kind of feels the same way, but there's a but But before she can say the second part, that being that she already had a boyfriend, he pretty much just cuts her off and sort of just takes that at face value. And then later on in the finale, when it comes to light that the butt was that, well, Sky already had a boyfriend, he somehow takes this very personally, even though he actively refused to listen to the second part when she was very much trying to make it apparent to him what the situation was. He just refused to listen. And then when he eventually found out, he basically took it personally against her. So I feel like that alone is pretty bad. But the biggest knock, and the main reason that I have him this low on the list, is that he votes himself out of the game. I mean, he literally comes in a merge where Sky essentially dumps him, like tells him how it is, tells him that it's never going to happen. And he is so distraught by this that he literally throws away his game. He literally votes himself out, thinking that this will somehow get him back in her good graces, only for it to backfire. He gets sent out, and from that point on, he essentially loses his mind. So it's a very unfortunate situation to be in. And again, I feel like on paper, it's not the worst game in the world, at least until the merge round, but it's the fact that he does vote himself out of the game, and he demonstrates a lot of unawareness of his surroundings when he's coming to handle Sky. That leads me to put him here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and similar to Dave, we have another pretty interesting figure to talk about, but one that has arguably more flaws with their game, but I do have him a bit higher. And here we have Max. And obviously Max did not vote himself out of the game. Now he does technically get ejected. However, he didn't technically vote himself out of the game. However, he still has a pretty major flaw in that he did receive the most votes during the round that Ella was ejected from the game. Had she not broken the rules, he would have been voted out there. So that is a pretty massive knock against his game. And if we're looking at the rest of it, it's not particularly great. I mean, he obviously builds an alliance with Scarlett, and he spends a lot of it thinking that he is the leader and that Scarlett is his sidekick, when in reality, Scarlett is way more well connected in the game, is way more intelligent than him, and is the one that is scheming more than he is. And eventually she does betray him, per se. So the fact that he didn't seem to pick up on the fact that Scarlett was better off in the game than he was is a pretty big knock. However, I feel like the biggest issue is the fact that he was supposed to be voted out during the Ella round, which does drag him down a decent amount. But if we're looking at the rest of his game, I mean, it doesn't really amount to the same issue as Dave voting himself out. So he is slightly higher than Dave. However, I feel like the rest of his game is not as impressive, and he's here number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have the highest ranked pre-merger left to talk about, and here we have Topher. And I kind of can't believe Topher is as high, as he doesn't really play the game for a lot of it. I mean, a lot of his run is essentially him trying to build his career for the next, after the show, basically. And there aren't really a ton of relationships you can really point to with him that would allow him to be too good in the game. However, the main reason that I have him this high is simply due to the fact that he does survive more elimination ceremonies than everyone else that we just talked about. He does survive 4 elimination ceremonies over the course of the season. No one else that we previously talked about did so, including Dave. And plus, he doesn't have that downside of Dave literally voting himself out of the game. At least Topher was trying to get a bit further into the game for no other reason than to give himself more screen time. But at the end of the day, there aren't too many moves that I can point to with Topher that would allow me to put him too much higher in the list. But again, considering his longevity and considering the amount of eliminations he survives, considering he is still technically a pre-merge boot. So because of that, I'm here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I've been pretty critical of this person in the past, and while they are technically in the top half of the list, I still feel like their game is pretty bad, especially considering their placement. But here we have the final boot of the season in Sugar, and as I said in my final boot rating, I feel like Sugar played a pretty mediocre game. Like I said, she's immediately on the outs when her closest ally Leonard is voted out. And throughout a lot of the game, she gets pretty lucky that her team doesn't attend more elimination ceremonies, as I feel like she probably would have been in some danger had they gone to some of those later ones. She gets into a lot of confrontations with people, and while she is somewhat successful in driving a wedge between Dave and Sky, I feel like their own internal uh, conflict is what ultimately does that in more than anything else. She does try to build an alliance with Shawn, but is unsuccessful there. Ella, in turn, tries to build an alliance with her, and she just flat out rejects her. Now, I kind of understand it because Ella was pretty bad socially, and she did get on her nerves. But again, the fact that she actively refuses an alliance that was hand gifted to her is pretty bad. And in fact, she even actively ensures that Ella is ejected from the game for singing, which isn't ideal either. At the merge, she does technically flip the vote against Sky to get out Dave, which is something at least, although you do have to also give it credit to Dave for wanting to vote himself out, so there's that. And then from that point on, she is in a pretty bad position at the Final Four, where she initially formed an alliance with Sky, but then after they revealed a format where the loser of the challenge is automatically eliminated, she pretty much immediately tries to turn her back against Sky and tries to get herself to the end with Shawn and Jasmine, which is not a great spot for her to be in. But it kind of works out for her anyway, where Sky is able to catch up and Jasmine goes out instead. But had she gotten what she wanted, she would have gone into the final three against a duo. And while that duo wasn't free of tension per se, it's still not great for her to be in. And coming to the final three, she essentially needs to win that final challenge, and she ultimately bombs it. So again, whenever I think of Sugar's game, I'm not particularly impressed with it. I mean, the only positive I can really give her is splitting up Dave and Sky, but even then, I feel like that was more so Dave being Dave than anything I can actively credit Sugar there. But she does technically get to the final three, and she does at least have that one move. But it's the fact that she was such a liability on her team for most of the game, in the fact that she actively does some poor work there, such as failing to build an alliance with Shawn and actively turning down and voting out someone that wanted to work with her, is enough to leave her here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have the lowest ranked person left to talk about, and here we have Scarlett. And as I talked about with Max, I feel like Scarlett was the more connected person in the game. Now, mind you, it's not like she played an amazing social game. I mean, she still didn't have too many alliances outside her relationship with Max, and she did try to get Max voted out, I mean, by pinning the blame on him, which I don't think was her ideal move, but it's still good that she was able to survive over him in that vote. It had the Ella stuff not happened. So I do give Scarlett a decent amount of credit for that. And she is able to get to the final 6 in a spot where she technically wasn't going to be targeted, but then she implements her plan of taking over the island, which ultimately backfires, setting her and Max out of the game. And I feel like between the two, Scarlett is clearly the one in control. She was clearly the more strategic one, the more competent one, the one that was able to convince Max that she was his sidekick, when in reality she was in control of things. And at the right time, she did turn on him, but by then, like, there were other things going on as well. So I can't have Scarlett all the way at the top because, yes, well, again, she was the better player between her and Max. I can't say that she played an amazing game. Plus, I feel like the top 3 people are all people who I am a bit more impressed by and were actually motivated to win the game as opposed to other things like taking over the island. So because of that, I have her here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3. And from this point on, we essentially have the final 4 minus Sugar, and it's just a matter of the order. But at number 3, we actually have one of the finalists from the season, and here we have Sky. And I remember back in my winner ranking, I wasn't too impressed by Sky, as I feel like she doesn't really have too many big pros for her game. And while she isn't free of issues with the game, as we'll get into in a moment, I don't feel like she did as much wrong as certain other winners, that particularly winners that end up lower on that winner ranking than she did. But if we're looking at her game, I mean, she's just kind of fine for a lot of the pre-merge. Like, she has good relationships with a lot of people there, namely Shawn and Dave. But obviously, Dave is Dave, and that entire pre-merge gets increasingly more weird for her, with Dave trying to get with her, but then her like starting to come around to her own feelings with him despite her already having a boyfriend. She tries telling Dave that she already has a boyfriend, but he just refuses to listen. And then at the merge, we get to a very weird situation where she obviously snaps at Dave, which prompts Dave to want to vote himself out. But even then, she is in the bottom two at the elimination ceremony. And she could have been in danger there had Dave decided to not give up her game for him. But, like that is what it is. And then she's essentially carried to the final four by the Max and Scarlett ejections. But even then, she was in the worst position of the people there, where she obviously has a duo in Shawn and Jasmine, and she has Sugar, who initially aligns with her, but after it's revealed what the challenge is and how the Final Four would work, Sugar immediately turns on her for whatever reason, even though that's not even that great for Sugar's game. But I actually think it benefits Sky quite a bit, because I feel like had that been a straight up vote, there is a decent chance that she gets targeted there had she not won that immunity. But she is able to scrape on by through that final four. And then the final three, same thing. She essentially just scrapes through there and gets pretty lucky that Jasmine is the one that's eliminated at final four, basically ensuring that she's in a good spot to get to the final two. And obviously she wins the game at the end. However, I feel like when we're looking at her game, I can't really attribute like one good move behind her. I feel like a lot of her game is just her being in a good position for the most part, and being in a not great position otherwise, but there's enough merit there for her to get towards the end of the game, and I can't really fault her too much, but I feel like there's just not as much merit as a lot of other winners. There's not really something that really elevates her the same way that I can talk about with other winners. So because of that, I only have to leave her here at number 3, and I feel like the top 2 were people that were in better positions than her even. So because of that, she is here number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2. And this person is weird to talk about because I feel like they definitely have lower lows than someone like a Sky, but also higher highs that allow me to prop her up a bit more. But here we have Jasmine. And Jasmine is definitely a bit of a rocky game to consider, as there are a couple things. One is she is the one person that really builds a close bond with Samey back when Samey was basically on the outs there, and she is the one that knows about Samey's secret after she basically forces her own sister out of the game. So there's that. She's obviously in the bottom 2 during the round in which Samey and Amy do come back and are eliminated at the same time. And however, she is in the bottom 2 there, and it's largely her own fault, where she decides that she wants to throw the challenge to buy time for Shawn to get back in there after Shawn essentially goes missing for a lot of that day. And she's obviously putting herself in a bad position intentionally, which on the face of it, I don't fault her too much for it, especially with Shawn being one of her closer allies. But then Shawn comes back into the challenge, not being aware of what's going on. He ends up winning it, beating her in a matchup. And then she just gets mad at Shawn for whatever reason, where she acts like Shawn is being ungrateful for the sacrifice that she's made, even though Shawn had no idea that Jasmine was trying to throw the challenge for her. And in turn, she basically puts her game in danger for seemingly no benefit other than to keep Shawn around. And I feel like her lack of self-awareness when she's dealing with Shawn, the fact that she's so indignant about it for the next couple episodes, is a pretty bad sign on its own. However, she does dominate the game for the most part along with Shawn, to where after the merge, she and Shawn are basically able to stay in a pretty good spot up until the final 4. And I feel like had that been a normal final 4 round, she would have been in a pretty good spot to get towards the end. However, it's just through to the format of the person that comes in last being automatically eliminated and her losing that challenge that causes her to go out. But even then, after she's eliminated, she tries to basically guilt Shawn into splitting the money with her if he wins. And by basically saying that he made this promise to her, even though he never made such a promise, and he clearly has no intention of keeping up with that promise. But I feel like, again, that sort of demonstrates how Jasmine can be a bit annoying as a character at times and can show a bit of lack of self awareness. However, I feel like out of all the people you talked about, she probably has had one of the most control in the game, along with Shawn for a lot of it. And yes, while there are some low lows, like her almost getting voted out at the round in which she was throwing the challenge, and then her like not being in the best light there when she gets mad at him, I do think there's enough merit there where she does control the game along with Shawn for a lot of it, especially in that post merge. And I feel like outside of that, I mean, yes, outside that one round, she is pretty well liked by a lot of the people there. And she is in a good position that's outside of that one round. But even then, I mean, you can credit that to Jasmine trying to protect Shawn. So I feel like had she not done that, she probably would have been in a good spot even moving forward. So I feel like there's a lot of good to give to Jasmine's game. However, there's enough rockiness there that leads me to put her here at number 2. And now at number 1, the player I believe played the best game on Pahkitew Island, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but here we have Shawn, the winner of the season. And I will say that I do kind of question how intentional Shawn was playing the game, as a lot of his shtick is him being about zombies and how he is very much trying to wave off the zombie apocalypse, and he's very much an individualistic person, being in everyone for themselves when it comes to him thinking that the whole world is about to end. And obviously that's not great, and I feel like that kind of rubs off in some degree, such as when that episode that I alluded to a moment ago, when he goes missing and he almost gets ejected from the game due to missing the challenge because he thinks Chef has become a zombie, and that's not great. You also have his relationship with Jasmine, which is negatively affected by the aforementioned incident where he does come back in and basically beats her at the challenge, putting her in a bad position. But then obviously towards the end, where obviously Jasmine does ask him to share the money with her, and he obviously doesn't want to do that because he wants to build a zombie survival shelter. And while I do technically think Jasmine's more at fault here, as she was already out of the game and should have had no expectation of getting any prize money, no matter who it was. I mean, it's still not great that Shawn is basically that selfish to where he is thinking for himself there. So I feel like from a pure character standpoint, Shawn isn't the best, and I feel like some of his qualities do translate to him not being the best player in the world. However, if we are just looking at the game that he has played, I think it's very impressive, and he is pretty high on my winner ranking, believe it or not, as he basically was in the majority the entire game. I mean, he had his relationship with Dave and Jasmine early on, also had a good enough relationship with Sky, and I mean, he does survive a lot of those early elimination ceremonies, never really being in any danger. I mean, yes, while I do fault him for turning down the alliance with Sugar, I mean, considering the fact that Sugar was largely against Dave and Sky, two people he had better relationships with, I mean, I kind of get it. I still think he should have accepted the alliance, but whatever. Then at the merge, I mean, he does lose Dave, but again, he's not going home at any point. I mean, he has a lot of allies coming into the end game, particularly Jasmine and Sky. And coming into the Final Four, I mean, he is in the best position at the Final Four, where he obviously wins a challenge for one. But even if he didn't win the challenge, I mean, no one was voting him out at that point, as he obviously had Jasmine, who was sticking by his side. Sky had no reason to vote him out. And even Sugar, who was the most volatile player in the game at that point, she was going after Jasmine as well as Sky over him. So I feel like he was in the best position there. And even at the Final Three, where he does lose Jasmine from that previous challenge, he was still in a good spot to where Sky and Jasmine were going after each other. He was basically guaranteed a spot at the end. But even then, he does win the challenge anyway, despite that format not really working out for him. And he does basically get to the end in a pretty dominant fashion. So on the whole, I feel like Shawn did play a pretty impressive game with very few holes in it. Now, mind you, I don't think Shawn is the best player in the world. I think there are plenty of issues with him from a character standpoint that do translate to him not being a good player on any given season. But if we're just looking at this season that he played on, he was very well set up. And I feel like he was never targeted at any point. And I feel like he made some decent moves that improved his position. So I feel like if we're looking at this cast as a whole, I feel like he's the very clear best player from the season, and because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. And now that I've done these player rankings for each season, I do plan to make a bigger video that essentially looks at every player in the show and ranks them based on how they are as players in general, which is probably going to be a very long video, but one that I hope will be interesting, so stay tuned for that. And of course, I do have other videos like this moving forward. And as usual, if you do like this content specifically about Total Drama, I do have a second channel where I talk about Survivor and Big Brother and shows similar to Total Drama where I talk about strategy and gameplay and stuff like that. So if you do like these videos, I highly encourage you to check out that channel. It's more of the same, so look out for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.